At 59 years old, Mike Tyson, once the most feared man on the planet, now finds himself facing a reality far more devastating than any opponent he ever stepped into the ring with. For decades, Tyson's name was synonymous with unmatched power, brutal speed, and a kind of raw intensity the world had never seen. He wasn't just a boxer, he was a force of nature, a global icon who rose from the harshest streets to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. But today, the story is different. The man who once stood invincible now faces battles that no audience can cheer him through, no trainer can guide him through, and no strength can punch his way out of. Behind the tough exterior, behind the legacy, behind the legend, lies a story filled with heartbreak, loss, trauma, financial ruin, declining health, and emotional pain that few truly understand. Moments ago, Tyson stunned fans around the world with a deeply personal revelation, one he has kept buried for years. It wasn't about a comeback fight, or a documentary, or a business venture. It was something far more raw, and far more tragic. The truth is that Tyson's toughest fight was never inside the ring. It was the life he was thrown into long before fame. It was the demons he spent decades trying to outrun. And now, at 59, those demons have caught up with him in a way that has shaken even his most loyal supporters. This is the heartbreaking tragedy of Mike Tyson, the story of a man who had everything, lost everything, rebuilt himself, and is now confronting the one opponent even Iron Mike cannot defeat, time. Before the world ever called him Iron Mike, before the knockouts, before the arenas filled with roaring crowds, Mike Tyson was just a terrified kid from Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the toughest, poorest neighborhoods in America. His story didn't begin with gloves, belts, or triumph. It began with fear, violence, and abandonment so deep that it still echoes through his life today. Tyson was born into a world where survival came before childhood. His father left early, disappearing from the picture before Mike was even old enough to speak his name. His mother struggled with poverty, addiction, and instability, leaving her children to fend for themselves. By the time Mike reached adolescence, he had already witnessed more brutality than most people endure in a lifetime. Bullied relentlessly because of his lisp, his weight, and his shy demeanor, young Mike became an easy target. Kids didn't just tease him, they beat him, humiliated him, cornered him in the streets. He once said that every day felt like a war he couldn't win. But something inside him shifted the day a group of boys killed his beloved pigeon, a small creature Mike cared for because it was the only thing in his world that didn't hurt him. That moment snapped something deep within him, igniting the rage that would later fuel his boxing career. By age 12, Tyson had been arrested nearly 40 times. He wasn't robbing stores for glory or toughness, he was stealing food, clothing, anything to survive. Most adults wrote him off as a lost cause. But then came the one person who changed everything, Cus D'Amato. When Tyson was sent to a reform school upstate, a counselor noticed his raw strength and incredible hand speed. He introduced Mike to D'Amato, a legendary boxing trainer known for turning troubled kids into champions. Cus didn't see a criminal, he saw a wounded child with unimaginable potential. Under Cus' guidance, Tyson found structure for the first time in his life. He learned discipline, respect, and self-worth. Cus didn't just train him physically, he rebuilt him emotionally. He taught him how to channel his anger into precision, how to turn fear into fire, and how to transform trauma into strength. For Mike, Cus became the father he never had. For Cus, Mike became the son he always wanted. Tyson blossomed quickly. His confidence grew. His technique improved. He began to master the peekaboo style, hands high, head moving, power surging from every angle. Cus famously declared, "This kid is gonna be the youngest heavyweight champion in history." Most laughed. But they didn't know the storm Tyson was becoming. Yet even as he rose through the amateur ranks, even as the world began to notice the unstoppable kid from Brooklyn, Tyson carried his old life with him. The abandonment, the grief, the violence, it lingered like a shadow, following him from fight to fight, from gym to home. And in moments when the cheers faded and the gym lights dimmed, the quiet darkness returned. Still, Tyson pushed forward. He trained with a determination born not from ambition, but from survival. Fighting was never about glory, it was about escaping the pain that shaped him. Every punch thrown was another step away from the nightmares of his past. But life had one more cruel twist in store. Just as Tyson's career was taking off, just when he finally had a stable home and a father figure, Cus D'Amato died. Tyson was only 19. That loss shattered him. It was the first great tragedy of his life, and it would set the stage for everything that followed, every mistake, every downfall, every heartbreak. The boy with nothing had become the young man with everything to lose. And soon, the world would see what happens when a broken childhood meets unimaginable fame. When Mike Tyson stepped into adulthood, he was already a force the boxing world had never seen before. At only 20 years old, he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history, fulfilling the prophecy Cus D'Amato had made years earlier. The world watched in awe as he dismantled opponents with terrifying speed and explosive power. Commentators compared him to a gladiator, fans viewed him as invincible. Every punch seemed to carry the weight of his past, every knockout a release of years of suppressed rage. But behind the championship belts and the roar of the crowd, a storm was forming. After Cus' death, Tyson lost the only stabilizing force in his life. The people who replaced Cus were not mentors, they were opportunists. Instead of guiding him, they surrounded him with temptation, chaos, and greed. The fame that should have been a blessing quickly became a curse. Suddenly Tyson had money, power, and global fame, but no one to protect him from himself. His life spiraled into excess. Lavish mansions, luxury cars, endless parties. Millions spent on strangers as if money couldn't disappear. And beneath it all, there was a desperate emptiness, a loneliness fame could never fill. His marriage to Robin Givens became tabloid fuel. Their relationship, turbulent and emotionally volatile, unfolded under a spotlight that magnified every flaw. Tyson was portrayed as unstable, dangerous, and out of control. He insisted he was misunderstood, but the media narrative was louder than his voice. Then came the moment that shook the boxing world, the Buster Douglas fight in 1990. Tyson entered the ring unfocused, undertrained, and surrounded by people who cared more about his earnings than his well-being. Douglas, a 42-1 underdog, did what no one believed possible: he beat the seemingly unbeatable Mike Tyson. It wasn't just a loss. It was a public unraveling. And the world had only witnessed the beginning. In 1992, Tyson's life collapsed completely when he was convicted and sentenced to prison. Whether fans believed in his guilt or innocence, one thing was painfully clear: the kid from Brownsville, who fought his way out of the darkness, had been swallowed by it once again. Prison changed him. It hardened him. It humbled him. And it isolated him from everything he once knew. When he was released in 1995, Tyson tried to reclaim his throne. The comeback fights brought huge audiences, but something was missing. The ferocity was there, but the discipline, the emotional structure Cus had instilled, was gone. He fought with anger, not strategy. With desperation, not focus. Then came the infamous moment that would define him for years, the Evander Holyfield ear-biting incident. It was a moment of pure chaos, a symbol of a man who had lost control of himself and his life. Tyson was suspended from boxing, mocked worldwide, and treated as a villain. Behind the scenes, however, he was crumbling. He battled addiction. He suffered financial devastation, losing over $300 million. He trusted the wrong people. He struggled with mental health. He felt trapped inside his own legend. By the early 2000s, Tyson's life had become a cycle of depression, fear, and regret. Even his physical health began to fail him: injuries, weight gain, and years of abuse to his body. The champion who once terrified opponents was suddenly fragile, exhausted, and lost. But what hurt the most was the realization that the one thing he was always good at, boxing, was slowly slipping away. The sport that saved him as a child was now destroying him as an adult. At 59, when Tyson looks back on his life, he doesn't see titles or fame. He sees the boy abandoned in Brooklyn. He sees the young man robbed of guidance. He sees the mistakes he made when no one was there to help him. And the tragedy becomes. For years, the world saw Mike Tyson as an unstoppable force, a man whose power made him seem superhuman. But behind the violent knockouts and intimidating persona was a human being who carried more emotional wounds than anyone ever imagined. And at 59, those wounds, some decades old, still haunt him in ways far more painful than any punch he ever took in the ring. Tyson has often said that the biggest battles of his life weren't against boxers like Holyfield or Lewis. They were against the shadows in his mind. The trauma of his childhood. The grief of losing the only father figure he ever trusted. The crushing weight of fame. The self-destructive habits that filled the emptiness inside him. For most of his adult life, Tyson used anger as armor. It protected him from the world, but it also isolated him from it. By the time he reached his late 30s, the persona, Iron Mike, had become a cage he couldn't break out of. People expected him to be violent, frightening, unpredictable. Even after he retired, that image followed him everywhere. He once admitted that whenever he walked into a room, people stared at him with fear, not respect. And that fear ate at him. But the emotional scars were only the beginning. Tyson's physical condition began to decline as well, and not gradually, it hit him fast and hard. Years of brutal fights, wild living, addiction, and untreated injuries caught up with him. His body, once a masterpiece of power and speed, began to weaken. He developed nerve problems. Chronic back pain. Sciatic issues so intense that he sometimes couldn't stand. Weight gain. Panic attacks. Depression so deep that he once feared he wouldn't survive it. For a time, Tyson even admitted he didn't want to live anymore. His biggest heartbreak came with the tragic death of his 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, in 2009. It was the kind of grief no parent can prepare for, and Tyson said it broke him in a way that nothing else ever had. He blamed himself, drowning in guilt, convinced that the chaos of his life had somehow cursed the people he loved. From that moment on, he was never the same. He withdrew from the world. He spiraled again into addiction. The man who once moved with explosive precision now struggled just to find purpose. He described waking up many mornings feeling empty, lost, and terrified of his own thoughts. But with time came self-awareness. Tyson entered therapy. He worked on his mental health. He confronted the demons he had spent decades running from. He stopped trying to be Iron Mike and started trying to be simply Mike, a human being with vulnerabilities, regrets, and a need for healing. Even so, the emotional and physical wear continued to build. At 59, he is a shadow of the unstoppable machine he once was. His voice is softer. His movements slower. His posture heavier. Some days, he can barely walk without assistance. And the injuries from his long career have begun to affect his memory, his balance, and his ability to function. He has said repeatedly that he feels like he's living on borrowed time. The most heartbreaking part? Tyson fears that his past, his mistakes, his violence, his chaos, will overshadow the good he has tried to do in his later years. He worries that the world will remember only the monster and not the man who fought so hard to change. He knows he can never escape his past. But he hopes, at the very least, people will understand the pain behind it. And that is the tragedy of Mike Tyson. He rose higher than almost anyone in history, yet he fell harder than most people could ever survive. And at 59, he is still trying to pick up the pieces. For most of his life, Mike Tyson believed that every problem could be solved the same way he handled opponents in the ring, through sheer force, unbreakable will, and the refusal to ever stay down. But as he reached 59, Tyson began facing battles that no trainer, no coach, no crowd's roar could help him prepare for. These weren't physical opponents. These were battles of the heart, of the mind, and of time, enemies that hit far harder than any heavyweight ever could. In recent years, Tyson had been working to rebuild everything he once destroyed: his relationships, his finances, his public image, and even his sense of self-worth. He embraced fatherhood with a tenderness that shocked those who once feared him. He spoke openly about trauma, addiction, and the loneliness that fame had amplified rather than healed. He trained not to fight others, but to fight his own demons. And for a while, it seemed like the former champion was finally finding peace. But life had one more devastating blow waiting. It began quietly: subtle memory lapses, moments of confusion during interviews, difficulty recalling dates and names. Tyson, who built a career on razor-sharp reflexes and an iron mind that could read an opponent's every movement, was suddenly losing track of simple details. At first, he brushed it off as aging. But the symptoms grew too persistent to ignore. Doctors warned him that decades of repeated head trauma had consequences he could no longer outrun. They spoke to him about neurological decline, cognitive impairment, and the long-term effects every fighter dreads but tries never to think about. For Tyson, the news was more than medical, it was emotional. It was spiritual. It was the possibility that the very battles that made him a legend were now coming back to take pieces of him away. And he wasn't just scared for himself. He was scared for the people he loved. Tyson had spent so many years trying to repair his bond with his children, to become the stable father he never had. The thought of slowly forgetting conversations, memories, or even faces haunted him in ways no opponent ever had. "I can handle pain," he confided to a friend. "But I don't want them to hurt because of me. I don't want to disappear while I'm still here." Financial stress added another layer. Tyson had rebuilt his fortune, but medical concerns, business pressures, and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily. The man who once earned hundreds of millions now found himself worrying about long-term security, not for himself, but for the family he wanted to protect. And then came the emotional struggle. Tyson had already stared down loss, addiction, humiliation, and the darkest loneliness. But this was different. This was a battle with an enemy he couldn't punch, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't escape from. Yet in the middle of all this, something remarkable happened. Tyson began speaking with a maturity and vulnerability that inspired millions. He talked about forgiveness, about survival, about the importance of humility. He encouraged younger fighters to protect themselves, to avoid the mistakes he made, to understand that life exists beyond the applause and brutality of the ring. He became, without ever expecting it, a mentor, not just to boxers, but to anyone carrying their own private battles. Now, at 59, Mike Tyson stands at a crossroads. The physical strength that once made him the most feared man alive is fading. The mental challenges ahead are real and frightening. And yet, through it all, Tyson still rises every day with the discipline he learned as a child in the gym: you get up. You fight. You keep moving. His story is tragic not because he has fallen, but because he has fought harder than most men ever will, inside and outside the ring. And as the next chapter of his life unfolds, one thing remains certain. Mike Tyson's greatest battle was never against an opponent. It was against life itself.